Hey guys, it's Danny. Today we're going to discuss about new growth on orchids, and this is a subject requested by my viewer Asa, and this gives me an idea. I'll try to make a sort of a series of video requests, so every Sunday I will make a video on a subject that one of you guys requests, and you can choose any subject you want when it comes to orchids, and I'll try to make a sort of an elaborate discussion about it and turn these subjects inside out. So let me know down below your video requests for next Sunday. We'll see how this works. But today let's focus on new growths. Let's see what they are, how you should be treating them, and a few observations that I had along the years. So we call a new growth a new structure on a sympodial orchid, one of those orchids that produces pseudobulbs or canes, such as Cattleyas, Oncidiums, Dendrobiums, and so on, not Phalaenopsis and Vandas. Those are monopodial orchids. Now, new growths are not baby plants, they're not cakeys, they're actually part of the very same plant. A pattern of growth for a sympodial orchid is to create multiple new growths, which eventually will mature into pseudobulbs, and the entirety of these structures form a single orchid. Now, I do have a video in which I discuss about cakeys versus new growth. If you're interested in that, you can check out the info card right here or the description below. But basically, a new growth refers to a new structure on an orchid. In the case of the sympodial, the formation of a new pseudobulb. Now, this is not scientific language, it's just simplified vocabulary so we can all understand each other and make dialogue simpler. So let's start with the beginning. A new growth is the formation of a pseudobulb. When it starts out live, it is a tiny little nubbin, as you can see right here. Can you imagine this little thing will transform into something like this? So usually they form at the base of the latest pseudobulb, but it's not a rule. Older pseudobulbs can create new growths as well. Now, an orchid can produce multiple new growths because each pseudobulb has at least 2 available eyes. The eye is actually the place where a new growth will form. In this case, I have only 1 new growth. In this case, though, I have 2 of them sprouting from the same pseudobulb. The place where you will most likely see a new growth forming is on the outside of an existing bulb. It's definitely not a rule, but most of the times a new growth will come on the outside of these leaves. It also happens that a new growth will form in between the last 2 leaves of a bulb. Usually in between the first leaves, the ones that are closest to the bulb, this is the place where spikes will be produced. But in some cases, new growths can be produced from here as well, if a spike was not created. Most of the times though, you will see the new growth on the outside of an existing pseudobulb. In a short while, the new growth will take more and more shape, and already we can discover some sort of tiny leaves. We call them sheaths, and they seem to overlap each other. It is not unusual to see sap droplets forming because the orchid is putting a lot of energy and a lot of her food into forming and developing the new growth. As time goes by, we will start to see little tiny leaves forming on the top of the new growth. They will be more and more elongated. Now, this is a pretty crucial time in the life of a new growth. Due to its shape, it is very prone to rotting if we're not careful. And here's what I mean. If you can see, all the leaves and sheaths are overlapping each other and they're very tight. Water can easily get trapped between them, and if it doesn't evaporate, it can lead to rotting and losing the new growth. Now, sadly, this is a common occurrence in homes and grow rooms which do not benefit of a lot of ventilation. No matter what we do, we cannot really emulate the breezes of air that orchids are usually exposed to in nature. So for this reason, it is important that you water the orchid carefully and try to not get any droplets of water in the sheaths of this new growth. If you do get some water into the new growth, the best thing to do is to get a paper towel or a napkin, and I'll show you how I like to go about it. First, I'll remove the water from the very top with a part of the napkin. It is very thin and it absorbs very well. And then I will go lower on the new growth and just squeeze it a little bit with the paper napkin. In this way, I force the water to come out, and if I can actually insert my paper napkin, I will do so in whatever crevices I see. When you do this, be careful not to squeeze too much because the new growth is pretty sensitive and you can break it. It would also help if you place the orchid in front of a running fan. This will not work 100% because of the layers of the new growth, which will trap the water there, so you still need the tissue, but just try to do the best job you can in removing all that water from the new growth because it really is a serious issue. So let's presume we are careful with our new growth. In time, we will start to notice the main leaves forming. Usually each new growth has 1 or 2 leaves on top and a few leaves on the sides, depending on the orchid. So you'll probably see either 1 leaf, like in the case of my phylogeny here, or multiple leaves, like in the case of an oncidium. At this point, again, it is very important that you do not place any water inside, because if we take a look inside, we can see it looks really similar to a funnel, and actually that's what it is. Water cannot fall on the sides, it will just go in through the funnel, and if it reaches the really low layers, it is really hard to remove. I will stray a little bit from the subject here, but this is important as well. So sympodial orchids are now really prone to crown rot. Why? Because usually at the top of a cane or a pseudobulb, usually you will not have this funnel formation. If you can see in my case here, the center of the leaf stops at some point, and usually there is a little bump here. If water drips here, it's perfectly fine because it will just drip on the sides. In the case of a Phalaenopsis, this doesn't happen because it continuously grows leaves, so you will always have this little funnel here. You will not have the end of a pseudobulb to practically level the leaf. It is the very same case with the new growth. It is really prone to crown rot while this funnel formation is still present. When the pseudobulb will mature, things will be much better, and crown rot will probably not be an issue, but while the new growth forms, it is a serious threat. This doesn't mean that all sympodials are safe from crown rot. Let's take the case of the Paphiopedilum orchid, which is a sympodial orchid in the sense that it creates new growth connected by a small rhizome, but its shape is funnel-like, just like a Phalaenopsis orchid. So even if Paphiopedilums are sympodial, they are still prone to crown rot. But let's get back to the subject. Now at some point you will notice a slowdown in growth. In the beginning, the new growth will seem to grow pretty fast, and at some point when quite a few leaves are visible, it will start to slow down and you might panic a little bit, but this is totally normal. What happens now is the formation of the actual pseudobulb, which happens at the base of the new growth. So at this point, it is perfectly normal for the orchid to slow down because not only does it have to grow these leaves, but also it has to start forming the pseudobulb, and that is quite a complicated structure. But if you're patient, in a little while you will start to see the pseudobulb poking out through the leaves and through the sheaths. Now this is not a fully mature pseudobulb, it is pretty much halfway, but at this point the new growth will really be slow in comparison to how it used to grow up until now. Perfectly normal, don't worry about it. In a little while you will have a perfectly mature pseudobulb with leaves and with roots as well. Now when a new growth matures into a complete functional new pseudobulb, it will probably produce flowers. This is not the case with all sympodials, but usually it happens with cattleyas and with oncidiums and other sympodials. And pretty much this is the blooming pattern. Whenever a new pseudobulb is matured, a flower spike will be produced. And to continue the cycle, after the flower spike is spent, the orchid will start to produce another new pseudobulb, and pretty much things will start all over again. Now, the time in which a pseudobulb completely matures depends on the orchid, on the species or variety. It can take from 6 months to a whole year, and maybe even more in some cases. Depends on the size as well. Now, there isn't much you can do to speed up the process because each orchid has her own rhythm, but the best thing you can do is try to provide the proper care, which is a multitude of factors such as proper temperature, proper light, proper watering, nutrients, and so on. All of these factors together will make sure that the new growth will mature in the fastest time possible. Now let us talk a little bit about size. Usually a new pseudobulb should be at least the same size as the previous one. But in many cases, this doesn't happen, and we end up with a tinier new growth. What does it mean? Well, it's very normal for new orchids. So let's presume you just bought the orchid, maybe you repotted it, the new growth turns out to be smaller than the previous one. It is perfectly normal if you consider that the orchid has to adapt to your new environment, it might have to adapt to a new medium, it might have to recover from root loss and all sorts of other stresses. So it is absolutely normal for the new growth to be tinier than the previous one in the case of new orchids or orchids who underwent some stress or sick orchids and so on. In time, the new growth that will be produced will be bigger and bigger, and your goal is to have new growths that will mature into pseudobulbs which are at least least the same size as the older pseudobulb or even bigger. If you manage to get them bigger, everything is okay and you're doing a great job. But if you have a new orchid with a tinier pseudobulb, that's perfectly normal. Don't panic. Care for the orchid as best as you can, and in time the new growths will grow bigger and bigger. On the other hand, if in time the new pseudobulbs produced are tinier and tinier, there's something wrong with that orchid. Either she's sick, either you do not provide the correct care, either there is something missing, maybe not enough nutrients, and so on. So that is a sign that you need to reevaluate the care for that orchid or its health. Now let's talk about another thing that happens quite often with sympodial orchids, and these are crinkly leaves or accordion-shaped leaves. This is normal for orchids which were dehydrated or suffered from stress or disease even. This is a sign of dehydration, so if your orchid went through a drought period or a period where it didn't have roots, this is pretty normal. What you don't want to see is this forming on a regular basis. This means the orchid is not receiving enough water, so maybe you should readjust your watering. Also, you need to check the root system and see if it's in good shape. And with some orchids, particularly Miltoniopsis, it is a sign of low humidity even. Many orchids are prone to having accordion-shaped leaves, so you need to check a little bit the environment. But some orchids, particularly Miltoniopsis nelliolars, will pretty much always have some wrinkly leaves here and there unless you grow your orchid in a very high humidity environment and so on. So with some orchids it can be slightly normal, but with most of them it should not happen. Things like oncidiums should be easy to care for in a home even if humidity is not very high, so wrinkly leaves should not occur in a home when the orchid is adjusted and perfectly healthy. So as I was saying, once a pseudobulb is mature, it created the flowers, the cycle starts once again, and the orchid will continue to grow through new canes and new pseudobulbs. As I was saying, your goal is to make sure your new pseudobulbs are at least as big as the older ones, if not bigger. And another important rule, never remove individual pseudobulbs, particularly the new ones. As I was saying, these are non-new plants, and orchids can be divided, but you will need at least 3 pseudobulbs, older ones, per division. If you have some very old pseudobulbs, you can remove them. Maybe they're already damaged, or maybe they're very tiny. But when it comes to new growth and new pseudobulbs, never remove any of them. Not when they're tiny and forming, not when they're mature. Leave them on. It is just the way this orchid grows. So okay guys, hope this was useful. If you're new to orchids, hope this shed some light. Thank you for suggesting. And if you have other ideas for a video request, let me know down below, and next Sunday maybe I will do a video requested by you. If you've enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, give it a thumbs down. Subscribe to my channel for daily orchid and plants videos, and I'll see you all next time. Bye! It is the ending of autumn, and for Phalaenopsis orchids, 'tis the time, am I right? We have a flower spike here, another one forming there, one more over here, tiniest little one here, 2 on this one, and the story goes on. Lovely time of the year if I do say so myself.